The air in the room was cold, manufactured. It smelled of paper and faint, expensive cologne. Across the polished mahogany table, a man I'd never met before cleared his throat. He adjusted his tie, a silk strip of navy blue that seemed too tight for his thick neck. The small, unblinking red light of a camera on a tripod watched me from the corner. It felt like an eye, judging every flicker of my own. "Mrs. Vance," the man said, his voice smooth and detached. "Let's go back to the moment just before the impact. You were on the highway, returning from the coast. Is that correct?" I nodded, my hands trembling in my lap. I clasped them together, trying to still them. "Yes." The word was a dry whisper. "Your husband, Robert Vance, was driving." It wasn't a question. Witnesses state the car swerved suddenly. "Can you tell us why?" I stared at the wood grain of the table. I could see Robert's hands on the wheel, his knuckles slightly white as he gripped it, the familiar sight of his wedding band. "There was Jadir," I said. It jumped out. The lawyer leaned forward slightly. "A dear. I see. In your initial statement to the police, you didn't mention a deer." A tremor ran through me. I was in shock. I didn't remember everything. "Of course," he said, but his tone held no sympathy. "Were you and your husband speaking at the time?" "I don't remember." "Were you arguing?" "Mrs. Vance," he pressed, his voice hardening just a fraction. "Were you having a disagreement? Perhaps about his driving?" The words were stones, pelting me. "No, we weren't arguing." "So you weren't distracting him in any way? You didn't raise your voice? You didn't grab his arm?" My head snapped up. I looked into his impassive face. "No," I said, the word finally finding some strength. "I loved my husband." He leaned back, making a small note on a yellow legal pad. The camera kept recording. His voice began to fade as the room blurred, replaced by the gentle hum of a refrigerator and the scent of dust and old memories. "That was a week ago. My life now is separated into two parts, before the letter and after. But the story really begins 3 months ago." In the silence. The silence was the first thing I noticed when I came home from the hospital. It was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered every room. For 45 years, this house had been filled with noise. Robert's booming laughter, the sound of our son, Michael, practicing his guitar as a teenager, the clatter of pots and pans from my daughter-in-law, Sarah, trying a new recipe, and most recently, the swayed, high-pitched chatter of my granddaughter, Lily, as she ran through the halls, her footsteps a tiny, joyful drumbeat. Now, there was nothing. The silence was a constant reminder of what I had lost, and what I had survived. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, my body a map of the accident, a dull ache in my ribs that sharpened with every deep breath, a limp that favored my left leg, where the doctors had put in a metal rod. But the physical pain was a whisper compared to the gaping wound in my soul. Survivor's guilt. The therapist at the hospital had called it a neat, clinical term for a monster that lived inside my chest, eating me alive from the inside out. Why me? Why was I the only one to walk away? Or, more accurately, to be carried away? The town of Cedar Creek, Oregon, tried to be kind. Neighbors left casseroles on my porch, their Tupperware containers returned clean, but with no note of thanks. People I'd known for decades would cross the street to avoid me, their faces etched with a pained sympathy I couldn't bear to see. At the grocery store, the cashier would avoid eye contact, her cheerful chatter dying on her lips as I placed my few items on the conveyor belt. I was a tragedy walking, a living memorial to the Vance family. My days fell into a bleak, featureless routine. I'd wake up when the pain in my hip became too sharp to ignore. I'd make coffee I barely drank and toast I couldn't eat. I'd sit in Robert's worn leather armchair, the one molded perfectly to the shape of his body, and stare out the window at the gray Oregon sky. The rain would fall, tracing sad, silvery paths down the glass, and I'd watch for hours. The house was a museum of a life that was. Sarah's half-finished pottery sat on a table in the spare room, covered in a thin layer of dust. A history textbook Michael had been reading was on the nightstand, a bookmark halfway through a chapter on the Civil War. In Lily's room, her crayons were still scattered on her little art table, a drawing of a lopsided, smiling sun tacked to the wall. I couldn't bring myself to touch any of it. To move anything would be to admit they were truly gone, that they weren't just on a long trip and would be walking through the door any minute. Some days, I would talk to them. "Robert, the azaleas are blooming." I'd whisper to the empty chair, "You would have loved how red they are this year." "Lily, darling," I'd say, standing at the door of her room, "Grandma has a new story for you." But the only reply was the suffocating silence. My brother-in-law, David, had come by once, a few weeks after the funeral. He was Robert's younger brother, a man who had always lived in Robert's shadow and wore his resentments like a threadbare coat. He stood awkwardly in my living room, refusing to sit down. His eyes, small and hard, darted around the room, assessing the furniture, the paintings on the wall. "It's a real shame, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice rough. "A real tragedy." I'd nodded, too numb to speak. He shuffled his feet. "Robert had a good life insurance policy, I hear, and this house, it's worth a pretty penny now." The words hung in the air, cold and ugly. I just stared at him. He must have seen the look on my face because he faltered. "I'm just saying, it's good you'll be taken care of." He cleared his throat and then, as he was turning to leave, he muttered the words that would become the anthem of my nightmares, the words that would be forged into a legal weapon against me. "Still," he said, not looking at me, "it's not right. The whole family, gone. You should have died too." He left before I could react, the front door closing with a soft click that echoed through the silent house like a gunshot. The monster in my chest roared, because his words were a perfect echo of the thoughts that tormented me every single night. 3 months after the crash, the casseroles stopped coming. The sympathetic phone calls dwindled to nothing. I was left alone with my ghosts and the silence. It was on one of those gray, drizzly Tuesday afternoons that the letter arrived. I remember the mail truck pulling away, its engine a cheerful hum in the otherwise quiet street. I limped to the mailbox, my hip protesting with every step. There were bills, junk mail, and one thick, cream-colored envelope. The return address was a law firm in Portland I'd never heard of. My first thought was that it had something to do with Robert's will, a final piece of paperwork to sign. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my family had shared thousands of meals, and opened it with a butter knife. The paper was heavy, official. My eyes scanned the dense, legal text, trying to make sense of the jargon. "On behalf of our client, Mr. David Vance." My heart gave a painful lurch. A wrongful death lawsuit. The words swam before my eyes. I read them again, and then a third time, my mind refusing to accept their meaning, alleging that the negligence of Eleanor Vance was a direct and proximate cause of the vehicular accident that resulted in the deaths of Robert Vance, Michael Vance, Sarah Vance, and Lily Vance. Negligence. My negligence. The butter knife slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the floor. The letter went on, detailing the claim. It said I had a history of distracting my husband while he was driving. It said my actions on that fateful day led him to swerve. It demanded financial compensation for the loss of his brother, nephew, and their family. It was demanding everything: house, the savings, the insurance money. It was demanding the very life that Robert had built to protect us. But it was the final paragraph that shattered me. It was a formal, legal restatement of the poison David had whispered in my living room. It accused me of being the reason my family was dead. It was a declaration that I was the one who deserved to be gone. I sat there for a long time, the letter shaking in my hand. The quiet kitchen seemed to press in on me. The hum of the refrigerator grew louder, more menacing. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like a countdown. Each tick was an accusation. My fault. My fault. My fault. I thought of Robert's hands on the wheel, of Sarah's laughter as she read a passage from her book aloud from the back seat, of Michael pointing out a hawk circling overhead, of Lily, humming a little song to herself, her small head resting against my shoulder. The memory was so clear, so painfully vivid. And then, the screech of tires, the horrifying lurch in my stomach, the world tumbling, a chaotic mess of shattered glass and screaming metal. And then, silence, a different kind of silence, the silence of the end. But it wasn't my end. The letter was a confirmation of my deepest, most secret fear. It wasn't just a random, tragic accident. It was a punishment, and I was the one being punished, left behind to live with the consequences. David hadn't just filed a lawsuit. He had passed a sentence. He had looked into the darkest corner of my soul and given my guilt a name. He had called it justice. The days that followed the letter's arrival are a blur of gray misery. I didn't answer the phone when it rang, its cheerful chime sounding like a mockery. I didn't open the curtains. The house became my tomb, and I was its willing occupant. The words from the lawsuit replayed in my mind on a merciless loop: negligence, direct cause, wrongful death. They were no longer just legal terms. They were my identity. David was right. I had survived. And for what? To haunt the halls of this empty house. A constant, painful reminder of everything that was gone. Perhaps giving him the house and the money was a form of penance. A small price to pay for the crime of breathing when my family was not. The thought of fighting, of hiring a lawyer, of sitting in rooms like the one from my deposition, felt impossible. It required a strength I no longer possessed. It required a belief in myself that had died on that highway. I wandered from room to room, touching the objects they had left behind. I'd pick up one of Lily's stuffed animals, a floppy-eared rabbit, and hold it to my chest, trying to remember the weight of her in my arms. I'd stand in Michael and Sarah's room, staring at the wedding photo on their dresser to bright, hopeful faces smiling at a future they would never have. In the garage, Robert's workbench was just as he'd left it, a half-finished birdhouse sitting next to his tools, waiting for a final coat of paint. Every object was an accusation. Every memory was a fresh wound. One afternoon, when the rain finally let up, I knew I couldn't stay inside any longer. I needed to see them. I put on my coat, my hands fumbling with the buttons, and drove the short distance to Cedar Creek Memorial Cemetery. The air was damp and smelled of wet earth and pine needles. I walked the familiar path, my limp more pronounced on the uneven ground. And there it was, a single, polished slab of gray granite, stark against the green grass. Vence, Robert, beloved husband, father, grandfather. Michael, beloved son, husband, father. Sarah, beloved daughter, wife, mother. Lily, beloved daughter, granddaughter. For names, one stone, an entire world condensed into a few chiseled words. I sank to my knees on the damp grass, the cold seeping through my trousers. I traced their names with my fingertips, the stone smooth and unforgiving beneath my touch. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, the words choked by a sob that tore through my chest. "Robert, my love, I'm so sorry. I don't know. I should have done something." I spoke to them all. I apologized to Michael for not being able to protect his family. I told Sarah how much I missed her laugh. I told Lily that all the stories in the world felt empty without her to listen to them. "He's suing me," I finally confessed to the silent stone. "David. He says it was my fault. And I think he's right. It has to be. Why else would I be here and you're not?" Tears streamed down my face, dripping onto the granite. I should just give him what he wants. The house, the money, none of it matters without you. It feels wrong for me to have it. It feels wrong for me to be here at all. I stayed there until the sky began to darken and the evening chill settled deep into my bones. I felt hollowed out, a fragile shell. I had made my decision. I would call the lawyer from the letter tomorrow. I would tell them I wouldn't contest it. Let David take it all. My punishment would be complete. On the drive home, a wave of dizziness washed over me. I realized I hadn't eaten anything all day. I hadn't eaten properly in weeks. My pantry was nearly bare. On pure instinct, I pulled into the parking lot of Henderson's Diner, a small, cozy place our family had been going to for years. The thought of cooking was unbearable, but maybe I could manage a bowl of soup. The bell above the door chimed as I entered. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, a scent so familiar it was painful. Mr. Henderson was behind the counter, wiping it down with a cloth. He was a kind man in his 70s, with a warm smile and eyes that had seen a lot. He looked up when I came in, and his smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a look of deep concern. "Eleanor," he said softly. "Good to see you." "Hello, Jim," I murmured, sliding into a booth in the corner, hoping to remain invisible. He brought over a glass of water and a menu I didn't need. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm all right," I lied. It was the automatic response, the one that stopped further questions. He didn't believe me. He leaned against the edge of the table, his expression serious. "I heard about what David's doing," he said, his voice low so no one else could hear. "It's all over town. It's a damn shame. Eleanor, it's cruel is what it is." I flinched, not wanting to talk about it. "It's a family matter, Jim. Robert was my friend for 40 years, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "He wouldn't stand for this. He wouldn't want you to just roll over and let his brother tear you down like this." Tears pricked my eyes again. "You don't understand," I whispered. "Maybe he's right." Mr. Henderson shook his head, a fierce, protective look on his face. "Don't you dare think that. Not for 1 second. That man is motivated by greed, not grief. I know he came to Robert for money a few months back. Robert turned him down. This is his way of getting it." His words hung in the air. I had known David was struggling, but I hadn't connected the dots. It didn't matter. The guilt was too strong. "I can't fight him, Jim. I don't have it in me." He reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a small, crisp business card. He slid it across the table to me. "My niece, Grace. She just opened her own practice here in town. She's young, but she's smart as a whip and tougher than she looks. Just talk to her, Eleanor. That's all I'm asking. For Robert's sake." I stared at the card. Grace Thompson, attorney at law. I didn't want an attorney. I wanted an end to the pain. But I saw the genuine plea in Mr. Henderson's eyes, and for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was the crushing weight of obligation to a friend. I took the card. 2 days later, I found myself standing outside a small office on Main Street. The sign was new, the paint still bright. I almost turned around a dozen times. My heart pounded with a familiar dread, but the image of Mr. Henderson's concerned face and the silent plea from the names on that granite stone pushed me forward. The office was small and tidy, filled with sunlight and thriving green plants. It wasn't the intimidating, mahogany-paneled room I had pictured. A young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor stood up from behind her desk. She couldn't have been more than 35. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Grace Thompson. Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." I sat stiffly on the edge of the chair. "Your uncle sent me," I said, my voice barely audible. "Mr. Henderson." "I know. He called me," she said, offering me a soft smile. "He's very worried about you." She folded her hands on the desk. "He told me about the lawsuit." I took the liberty of looking up the filing. "It's aggressive." I nodded, my eyes fixed on a spot on her wall. "I don't want to fight it," I said, the words I had practiced rushing out of me. "I just want it to be over. I want to sign whatever I need to sign. They can have the house. They can have everything. I just want to be left alone." Grace listened patiently, her gaze never leaving my face. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, the silence in the room was different from the one in my house. It was an attentive silence, a respectful one. "Mrs. Vince, she said finally, her voice clear and steady. What David is doing is a tactic. It's called emotional battery. He isn't just suing you for money. He is banking on your grief and your guilt to make you surrender without a fight. He's using your love for your family as a weapon against you. I shook my head. But what if he's right? What if I did distract Robert? I can't remember everything so clearly. Stop, she said, her voice firm but not harsh. It cut through my spiraling thoughts. Let's talk about facts. The police report cited wet roads and a probable animal crossing as the cause. There were no skid marks indicating a sudden, panicked stop. Your husband was a safe, experienced driver. There's not a shred of physical evidence to support this claim. All David has is speculation and cruelty. She leaned forward. This isn't about what happened in the car, Mrs. Vince. This is about what's happening now. He is trying to rob you of your home, your security, and your future. But more than that, he is trying to rewrite the story of your family. He wants their legacy to be this ugly, greedy lawsuit. He wants your final memories of your husband to be tainted with doubt and blame. Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Rewrite the story, tainted with doubt and blame. She was right. That's exactly what was happening. My beautiful memories were being warped, poisoned by David's accusations. The love story that had spanned nearly 50 years was being reduced to a single, questionable moment. I cannot tell you what to do, Grace continued, her voice softening. If you want to surrender, I will help you negotiate the most peaceful terms possible. But I want you to know that you have a choice. You don't have to accept his version of the truth. We can fight this. Not just for the house or the money. We can fight for the honor of your husband. We can fight for the memory of your family. We can fight for you. For the first time since I read the letter, I felt a tear slide down my cheek that wasn't born of grief or guilt. It was a tear of anger. A hot, cleansing anger. How dare he? How dare David try to destroy the one thing I had left me memories? How dare he try to desecrate their names for money? I looked at Grace Thompson. At her clear, unwavering eyes. She wasn't just offering legal counsel. She was offering me a lifeline. She was offering me a shield. She was the first person to look at me and not see a fragile victim or a guilty party. She saw a survivor. A tiny, fragile ember of defiance began to glow in the cold, dead ashes of my heart. It wasn't much, but it was something. I took a deep, shaky breath. Okay, I said, my voice cracking but firm. Okay, let's fight. Leaving Grace Thompson's sunlit office was like stepping back into a world whose colors had been slightly restored. The gray sky didn't seem as oppressive. The damp air didn't feel as chilling. I walked to my car not as a ghost, but as a woman with a purpose. It was a fragile, terrifying purpose, but it was mine. The decision to fight felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark, hoping something or someone would catch me. That someone was Grace. The next morning, we met again. This time, she had a legal pad filled with neat, precise handwriting. She laid out the first steps of the battle ahead. The process is called discovery, she explained, her voice calm and methodical. It's where both sides exchange information. They'll send us a list of questions they want you to answer under oath, called interrogatories. They'll request documents, file records, phone records, anything they think will help their case. And we will do the same to them. The thought of David's lawyers picking through the details of my life, of my marriage, made a cold knot form in my stomach. They are looking for anything that suggests a pattern of conflict between you and Robert, Grace continued, her eyes meeting mine. They will twist anything they can find. A credit card statement showing separate purchases might be framed as financial secrecy. A text message sent in frustration could become evidence of a broken marriage. But our marriage wasn't broken, I said, the words coming out stronger than I expected. We had arguments. Who doesn't? But we loved each other. I know that, Grace said with a reassuring nod. And our job is to prove it. We're not going to play their game. We're not going to fight lies with more lies. We're going to fight them with the truth. An overwhelming, Undeniable truth. She slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a list. "This is your homework," she said. "I want you to gather anything and everything that tells the story of your life with Robert. Photographs, letters, old anniversary cards, home videotapes if you have them, journals, anything that shows the life you built together." I stared at the list. She was asking me to do the one thing I had been avoiding for months, to deliberately step back into the past, to open the boxes I had kept sealed, physically and emotionally. "I don't know if I can," I whispered. "I know it will be painful," Grace said gently. "But these aren't just memories, Eleanor. Right now, they are our best evidence. David is painting a picture of a miserable couple. We need to show a jury the truth. We need to show them the 45 years of birthday parties, vacations, quiet evenings, and inside jokes. We need to show them Robert's love for you, in his own handwriting." She was right. It was a strategic move, a legal necessity. But for me, it felt like a sacred duty. I was being asked to become the curator of our love story, to protect it from desecration. The first hint that the battle had already begun outside of Grace's office came a few days later. I had run out of milk and forced myself to go to the local market, the one I'd been shopping at for decades. As I walked down the dairy aisle, I saw Martha Gable, a woman from my old book club. "Martha," I said, a small, hopeful smile on my face. It was the first time I had initiated a conversation in public since the accident. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. The friendly smile she usually wore froze on her face. "Oh, Eleanor. Hello," she said, her voice strained. She clutched the handle of her shopping cart, her knuckles white. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't offer a word of sympathy. She just nodded curtly, turned her cart around with a squeak of the wheels, and hurried down the aisle as if I were carrying a contagious disease. The coldness of her reaction was like a slap. I stood there for a long moment, my hand hovering over the milk cartons, feeling the chill of the refrigerated air seep into my skin. I suddenly felt like every eye in the store was on me. I grabbed the first carton I could reach, paid in cash, and fled, my heart hammering against my ribs. I told myself I was imagining it, that Martha was just having a bad day. But it happened again. At the post office, a man I'd known since Michael was in Little League saw me, gave a stiff, awkward nod, and then became intensely interested in a flyer for a missing cat. The whispers started, too. I could feel them more than hear them. A sudden silence when I entered a room, heads turning away. The subtle, yet unmistakable, shift in the town's atmosphere. I was no longer just the tragic Mrs. Vance. I was becoming something else. The accused. The breaking point came when I overheard two women talking near the pharmacy counter. I was hidden by a tall display of vitamins, waiting for a prescription for my hip pain. "Can you believe the nerve?" one of them whispered. "Suing his own sister-in-law after everything she's been through." "Well," the other one said, her voice dripping with Fox sympathy, "Beverly told me David's lawyer has proof that she and Robert fought constantly, always nagging him about money, about his driving. It's just terrible." Apparently, she was a real handful. The blood drained from my face. A handful. They were talking about me. David wasn't just filing a lawsuit. He was methodically poisoning the well, turning the community I had called home into a jury of hostile strangers. He was taking their sympathy for me and twisting it into suspicion. I left the pharmacy without my prescription. As soon as I got home, I locked the door and called Grace, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. I recounted the conversation, my voice cracking with a mixture of rage and despair. "This is what they do, Eleanor," Grace said, her voice a calm anchor in my storm. "It's a classic smear campaign. They can't win on the facts, so they attack your character. They leak false information to create a narrative. Don't let them get to you. It's a sign of weakness on their part, but they're believing him." I cried. "These are people I've known for years. Then we have to be stronger," Grace replied, her voice unwavering. Which is why your homework is so important. We need to build a fortress of truth so high that their lies can't get over the walls. Have you started looking for those items? I hadn't. I had been too afraid. But now, the fear was being burned away by anger. They called me a handful. They called my marriage a battlefield. Fine. I would show them what my marriage really was. That evening, I climbed the rickety pull-down stairs to the attic. The air was thick with the scent of cedar, dust, and time. It was our archive, the place we stored the physical evidence of our lives. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, labeled in Robert's neat, architectural print, Christmas ornaments, Michael's school projects, taxes. In the far corner was a large wooden trunk. It didn't have a label. It didn't need one. It was our heart. I lifted the heavy lid. On top lay a stack of photo albums. I pulled one out and sat on the dusty floor, the single bare bulb overhead casting a warm, yellow light. I opened it to the first page. There we were, two impossibly young people squinting in the bright sun on our honeymoon in California. Robert had his arm around me, his grin so wide it seemed it could split his face in two. He was wearing a ridiculously loud Hawaiian shirt that I had teased him about relentlessly. I remembered that day. I remembered the taste of the salt on the air, the warmth of his hand in mine. I turned the page. Michael's first birthday, his face smeared with chocolate cake, a family vacation to the Grand Canyon, Lily just a toddler on Michael's shoulders, her tiny hands clutching his hair, Sarah and Michael on their wedding day, looking at each other with an incandescent love that mirrored what I felt for Robert. I went through album after album, the hours melting away. These weren't photos of a family in turmoil. They were photos of a family that was deeply, contentedly happy. We weren't perfect. We had our struggles, our worries, our moments of friction. But the foundation was solid. The foundation was love. Beneath the albums were bundles of letters, tied with faded ribbon. I found a packet of them from the first year we were married. When Robert's engineering job took him to a remote site for a month, I untied one and carefully unfolded the brittle paper. His handwriting filled the page. My dearest Eleanor, it's only been a week, but the silence in my room at night is deafening. It's not a real silence, not like the one we share. This one is just empty. I find myself turning to tell you about my day before I remember you're not here. I miss the sound of your laugh more than I can say. You are my anchor, my love. Come home soon isn't right, because you are my home. I am the one who needs to come home to you. All my love, forever. Robert. I held the letter to my chest, tears blurring my vision. This was the man they were trying to portray as my victim. This was the marriage they called broken. This love, this beautiful, enduring love, was my truth. I spent all night in that attic, surrounded by the ghosts of my life. But for the first time, they weren't haunting me. They were arming me. Every photograph was a shield. Every letter was a sword. I wasn't just a grieving widow. I wasn't just a defendant in a lawsuit. I was a witness, the last living witness to a great love. And I would be damned if I let David Vance, or anyone else, tell a different story. Armed with the contents of the attic, I returned to Grace's office feeling like a soldier preparing for battle. I brought boxes filled with albums, letters, and even a few of Robert's old journals where he occasionally jotted down his thoughts. Grace and I spent an entire afternoon spreading the artifacts of my life across her large conference table. It felt strange and intimate, sharing these private moments with someone who was, until recently, a stranger. But Grace handled each item with a quiet reverence that put me at ease. She wasn't just looking for evidence. She was listening to the story. She'd pick up a photo and I'd tell her about the day it was taken. A disastrous camping trip where it rained the entire time, but we laughed so hard our sides ached. The day Michael graduated from college, and Robert was so proud he couldn't stop clapping, even after everyone else had sat down. The Christmas morning Lily received the dollhouse Robert had secretly spent months building for her in his workshop. "This is it, Eleanor," Grace said, her eyes shining as she looked over the sprawling collage of our life. "This is our fortress. Their case is built on a foundation of sand. Ours is built on this, on rock. But the other side was busy building their own narrative. A few weeks later, I received a thick package in the mail. It was their first round of interrogatories. Pages and pages of intrusive, personal questions, each one designed to be a small, sharp jab. On how many occasions in the past 5 years did you and Robert Vance have disagreements? Regarding financial expenditures, detail every instance in which you expressed concern or criticism about Mr. Vance's driving abilities. Were you taking any prescription medication on the day of the accident that may have impaired your judgment or emotional state? Grace had warned me this would be invasive, but seeing it in black and white made me feel violated. They were mining my life for any crack they could exploit. Any moment of normal human friction they could magnify into a fatal flaw. We spent days crafting the answers, Grace ensuring every word was precise, factual, and devoid of the emotional bait they were looking for. Then came the request for depositions. They wanted to question our friends and former colleagues. They wanted to put the people we knew on the record. David had provided a list of namespeople he believed might harbor some small grievance or be easily swayed by his narrative. It was a clear attempt to isolate me further, to make everyone in my life choose a side. One of the names on their list was Sarah's best friend, a woman named Chloe. I hadn't spoken to her since the funeral. When Grace called to inform her she would be deposed, Chloe agreed immediately, but her loyalty was not with me. She told Grace that Sarah had complained to her on several occasions that I was overbearing, and that Michael often felt caught in the middle. The news was a gut punch. I remembered the instances she was likely referring to. I had offered unsolicited advice about raising Lily. I had once expressed worry that Sarah was working too hard at her pottery studio. I thought it was a mother-in-law's concern. Chloe, prompted by David's lawyers, would frame it as relentless criticism, another brick in their wall of lies. The town felt smaller every day. The invisible lines were being drawn. The Hendersons at the diner were firmly in my corner, always offering a warm smile and a free cup of coffee. But others, like Martha Gable, would now cross the street with an almost theatrical deliberateness. The lawsuit had become the town's central drama, and I was its unwilling protagonist. The weight of it all was immense. There were days I would wake up with a feeling of such profound exhaustion that getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. The midpoint of this slow, agonizing siege came in the form of a mandatory settlement conference. It wasn't a trial, Grace explained, but a meeting with a neutral mediator to see if we could reach an agreement and avoid court. David and his lawyer would be there. I dreaded it for weeks. The thought of being in the same room with David, the man who had torn my world apart a second time, made me physically ill. Grace was a pillar of calm. "You don't have to say much," she told me the morning of the conference. "Let me do the talking. We are there to listen to their offer and present our position. Nothing more. Stay calm. We are in control." The meeting was held in a sterile conference room in a Portland law office, the same building where my deposition had been filmed. The air was just as cold. David sat across the table, next to his lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies, whose sharp suit and polished shoes seemed to reflect his predatory smile. David wouldn't look at me. He stared at his hands, his face a mask of sullen resentment. Mr. Davies began by offering his insincere condolences. Then he launched into his attack. He painted a picture of me as a controlling, anxious woman who had worried Robert into an early grave. He spoke of my constant complaints and emotional outbursts as if they were established facts. I sat there, gripping the arms of my chair, my knuckles white, while Grace calmly took notes, her expression unreadable. "My client, Mr. Vance, is not a vindictive man," Davies said, oozing false sincerity. "He is grieving the loss of his beloved brother, but he also believes in justice. He believes that responsibility must be taken." Then came the moment that changed everything. "We have evidence," Davies said, pausing for dramatic effect, "that Mrs. Vance's behavior was not just a general pattern, but a specific problem on the day of the accident. We have obtained text messages from Mrs. Vance's phone. My blood ran cold. I looked at Grace, confused. We had turned over all my phone records. There was nothing. Davies slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a printout of a single text message. It was from me, sent to my son, Michael, 3 days before the accident. I stared at the words, my own words, now twisted into a weapon. On our way to the coast. Your father is driving like a maniac again. I swear this man is going to give me a heart attack. Wish me luck. I remembered sending it. Robert had been cheerfully speeding down the highway, singing off-key to an old song on the radio, and I had sent it as a joke. It was our running gag. Robert's lead foot and my mock dramatics about it. Michael would have read it and laughed, probably sending back a funny emoji. But here, in this cold, sterile room, stripped of context, stripped of love, the words were ugly. They were damning. Driving like a maniac again. Davies read aloud, savoring each word. The use of the word again establishes a clear pattern. Going to give me a heart attack shows her extreme level of anxiety. This message, sent just days before the crash, proves that Eleanor Vance was a nervous, critical passenger who was actively and emotionally fixated on her husband's driving. It is not a leap to conclude that this fixation boiled over on the day of the accident, causing a fatal distraction. The room was silent. I couldn't breathe. He had taken a moment of light-hearted banter, a piece of our family's private language, and forged it into a murder weapon. He was using my love and my humor against me. I looked across the table at David. For the first time, he met my gaze. There was no remorse in his eyes, only a cold, hard triumph. Grace began to speak, to argue about context and misinterpretation. But I couldn't hear her. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I felt the floor drop out from beneath me. The fortress of truth I had so carefully built felt like it had been blown to pieces by a single, perfectly aimed cannonball. They had my own words. How could I fight my own words? My carefully constructed composure crumbled. A sob escaped my lips, a raw, wounded sound. I pushed my chair back, stood up on shaky legs, and fled the room, unable to bear another second in that place. I stumbled down the hallway, the sound of Mr. Davies's smooth, victorious voice fading behind me, replaced by the monstrous echo of my own joking words. Driving like a maniac again. Driving like a maniac. My fault. I collapsed onto a bench in the lobby, my face in my hands, the carefully patched up dam of my grief breaking completely. The lawsuit was no longer just a legal battle. It was a public dissection of my life, where every memory was a potential crime, and every word I'd ever spoken could be used to condemn me. And in that moment, sitting in the cold, impersonal lobby of a law firm, I was no longer sure I could win. I was no longer sure I deserved to. Grace found me in the lobby a few minutes later. I was still huddled on the bench, a wreck of a woman trying to hold herself together in a public space. She sat beside me, not speaking, just placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. The simple, human contact was grounding. "We're leaving," she said, her voice soft but firm. There was no judgment in it, only a quiet resolve. She helped me to my feet, led me out into the gray Portland afternoon, and drove me home in a silence that felt compassionate rather than empty. When we arrived back at my house, she walked me inside. I collapsed into Robert's armchair, the familiar worn leather offering little comfort. "He won, didn't he?" I said, my voice hollow. "With that text message, what can we say? Those are my words." "Eleanor, look at me," Grace said, kneeling in front of me so our eyes were level. "Listen very carefully. We did not lose anything today. We saw their best shot. That text message is the strongest piece of evidence they have. And what is it? A single, out-of-context message. It's flimsy, and it's manipulative, but it is not a smoking gun. Davies just made it feel like one, because he's a theatrical bully. But it makes me look horrible." I whispered, like I was miserable, like I hated the way he drove. "Of course it does. That's the entire point, she said, her voice regaining its sharp, analytical edge. Their whole case is an illusion. It's a story they're telling. And for a moment in that room, you believed their story instead of your own. Don't let them do that. Don't let them be the authors of your life. Her words made sense on an intellectual level, but my heart was bruised and battered. The public humiliation, the twisting of my private joke into something a Goliath had shaken me to my core. For the next few days, I retreated back into myself. The fortress had been breached, and I didn't have the strength to repair the walls. I stopped answering Grace's calls. I let the newspapers pile up on the porch. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt less like grief and more like defeat. I felt haunted by the family I had lost, and now I was haunted by the woman they were telling the world I was. Was I that person? A nagging, anxious wife, a critical mother-in-law? When you are told a story about yourself enough times, you begin to wonder if it's true. David's lawsuit had become a distorted mirror, and I was starting to see the monster in the reflection. I stopped going to the attic. The photos and letters now felt like a lie. Maybe all those smiling pictures just hid a deeper unhappiness. Maybe Robert's loving words were just a habit. Doubt is a poison, and I was drinking it down, letting it seep into every memory I had. One evening, unable to sleep, I found myself standing at the doorway of Lily's room. It was the one place I hadn't touched. Not really. It was almost a shrine. Her bed was still made, her favorite stuffed animals arranged on the pillow. Her small desk was cluttered with drawings and craft supplies. I felt a desperate, aching need to feel close to her, to the one person in my life whose love had been pure, simple, and uncomplicated. I sat on the edge of her small bed, the mattress barely dipping under my weight. My eyes fell on a brightly colored box tucked under her desk. It was a show box, covered in glitter and stickers. On the lid, in a child's careful scrawl, were the words, Lily's memory box. Memory, misspelled in the way only a 7-year-old could. My hands trembled as I reached for it. I hadn't looked inside since the accident. I didn't know if I could bear it, but the need to connect was stronger than the fear of pain. I lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of a child's treasures, a smooth, gray stone from the beach, a robin's egg, miraculously intact, a ticket stub from her first movie, a pressed flower from my garden. Each item was a tiny, perfect memory, and tucked in the corner, underneath a string of plastic beads, was a small, spiral-bound notebook. Her diary. My first instinct was to close the box. A diary is a private thing. It felt like a violation. But then I saw the cover. She had drawn a picture of herself and me, two smiling stick figures holding hands. Above it, she had written, "Me and Grandma." With a deep breath, I opened it. Most of the pages were filled with simple observations about her day. Today we had pizza for dinner. It was yummy. My tooth is wobbly. But as I gently turned the pages, I saw that her entries had started to become more detailed. She was learning to express her thoughts, her feelings, and then I found the last entry she ever wrote. It was dated 2 days before the trip to the coast, the day before I sent that fateful text message. My eyes scanned the page, her loopy, uneven handwriting filling the lines. "Grandma is coming tomorrow to go with us to the ocean. I am so excited. She's going to bring her special story book. She tells the best stories. She makes funny voices for all the animals. Mommy says Grandma is the best storyteller in the world. When she reads, it feels like a hug. I love my grandma. She is my best friend." The notebook slipped from my fingers and fell into my lap. I read the words again, and then a third time, letting them wash over me. A warm, healing balm on my wounded soul. It feels like a hug. In that moment, the distorted mirror shattered. The monster they had created vanished, replaced by the image of a woman who made her granddaughter feel loved and safe. A woman who was a storyteller. A woman who was a best friend. This was the truth, not the twisted words of a text message, but the pure, honest words of a child. This was my fortress. This was my rock. Lily, in her innocence, had given me a weapon more powerful than any legal argument. She had given me back to myself. At that same moment, a new thought began to form, a connection I hadn't made before. Lily loved my stories, and I was a librarian for 40 years. My life was built on stories, on words, on context and meaning. David and his lawyer were trying to win with one sentence, ripped from its context. But I had a whole library, a surge of energy, of pure, righteous clarity, pulsed through me. I stood up, went to my study, and began to write. I wrote down everything I could remember about my relationship with Robert and his driving. I wrote about the countless road trips we had taken, the cross-country adventures. I wrote about how he taught Michael to drive on those same quiet Oregon roads. I wrote about his meticulous attention to car maintenance, his pride in his perfect driving record. And then I wrote about the joke, the driving like a maniac joke. It started 20 years ago on a trip to Yellowstone. He had been so excited to get there he was driving a little too fast, and in a moment of playful drama, had clutched my chest and declared he was a maniac who would be the death of me. He had laughed so hard he had to pull over. From then on, it became our thing, a term of endearment, almost a private joke that signaled the start of an adventure. It wasn't a complaint. It was a tradition. I wrote for hours, the words pouring out of me. When I was done, I had pages and pages of context, the full story. The next morning, I called Grace. "I'm ready," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I want you to schedule my deposition. I want to tell them my story." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Eleanor," she said, her voice filled with a cautious relief. "What happened?" "I found a new piece of evidence," I told her. "It's from a very reliable witness." I didn't tell her it was from Lily's diary. That was for me. That was the source of my strength, the secret fuel for the fire that had just been relit, but the strength itself that was for everyone to see. I was no longer a victim cowering in the ruins. I was Eleanor Vance. I was a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and I was the keeper of our story, and I was finally ready to tell it. The day of my second deposition felt entirely different from the first. The air in the conference room was just as cold. The lawyer, Mr. Davies's smile just as predatory. But something inside me had shifted. I was no longer a frightened animal cornered by hunters. I walked in with my head held high, Grace by my side. I carried Lily's words in my heart like a hidden shield. "It feels like a hug." Mr. Davies began with the same smug confidence he'd displayed at the settlement conference. He clearly believed he had broken me. He circled back to the text message almost immediately, laying a printout of it on the table between us as if it were a winning card. "Mrs. Vance," he began, leaning forward, "let's return to this message you sent your son. Your father is driving like a maniac again." A strong choice of words. Wouldn't you agree? "It was a joke," I said calmly, my voice even. I looked directly at him, not at the table, not at the camera. "A joke," he scoffed. "It doesn't read like a joke, Mrs. Vance. It reads like a cry for help, a statement of fear." "That's because you don't have the context," I replied. "Words can have different meanings, depending on the story they're a part of. You've chosen to tell one story with that sentence. I'd like to tell the whole story." Before he could interrupt, I began. I told them about the trip to Yellowstone 20 years ago. I described Robert's infectious, boyish excitement, the way he would drum his hands on the steering wheel in time with the radio. I recounted my dramatic gasp, my hand to my heart, and the sound of his booming laughter that filled our old station wagon. It became our private signal. I explained, my voice steady, filled with the warmth of the memory. It meant, here we go again, another adventure. It was a term of affection, Mr. Davies. It was part of the language of our marriage. When I texted that to my son, he knew exactly what it meant. He knew his father was happy, that we were excited, and that I was playfully teasing him. He would have pictured us on the road, singing along to the radio, about to start a few wonderful days at our favorite place on the coast. I paused, letting the silence settle. Davies's smirk had faltered. He was a storyteller, but I was a librarian. I knew the power of a narrative better than he did. You've tried to portray my husband as a reckless man and me as his terrified passenger. I continued, my voice gaining strength. But the truth is, Robert Vance was the safest man I ever knew. Not just behind the wheel of a car. He was the man who built a railing on our porch stronger than it needed to be, just in case. He was the man who checked the smoke detector batteries every month without fail. He was the man who held my hand every time we crossed a busy street. Even after 45 years, his entire life was about building things that were safe, strong, and meant to last. Our marriage was one of them. I could see a flicker of uncertainty in Davies's eyes. He was losing control of the narrative. He shuffled his papers, trying to find a new line of attack. That's a very touching story, Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. But it doesn't change the fact that you were critical of him. Let's talk about your daughter-in-law, Sarah. We have a sworn statement from her best friend, Chloe, who says Sarah often complained about you being overbearing. The old wound throbbed, but I was ready for it. I thought of Sarah, of her fierce passion for her art, her sometimes chaotic energy. I loved Sarah like my own daughter, I said, and the truth of that statement resonated in my voice. Did I sometimes offer advice she didn't ask for? Yes. Did I worry about her? Yes. That's what mothers do, and what mothers-in-law do. Sometimes we get it wrong, but my concern came from a place of love, not criticism. I looked him straight in the eye. Tell me, Mr. Davies, in the 42 years my son was alive, how many times do you think I told him I loved him? 1,000 times? 10,000? You have found one or two instances where someone interpreted my concern as criticism, and you wanted to build a case on that? You want to nullify a lifetime of love with a handful of misinterpreted moments. That is not justice. That is desperation. The air in the room had shifted. Grace sat silently beside me, a small, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every word. I was no longer just answering questions. I was bearing witness, while I was finding my voice. Grace was pursuing her own strategy. She had filed a subpoena for David's financial records. It was a long shot. The judge might not grant it, deeming it irrelevant, but Grace argued that motive was central to the case. Was this lawsuit born of genuine belief, or financial desperation? Her gamble paid off. The judge agreed. A week later, Grace called me. Her voice was electric. We got them. Eleanor. His bank records. His credit card statements. Everything. And I asked, my heart pounding. He's drowning, she said. He has a second mortgage on his house he can't pay. He's maxed out 3 credit cards. He has a business loan that's in default. But here's the kicker. 2 weeks before the accident, he made a wire transfer of $5,000 to an online gambling site. And a week before that, there's a record of a phone call from his phone to Robert's that lasted for 22 minutes. Mr. Henderson's words came rushing back to me. I know he came to Robert for money a few months back. Robert turned him down. It wasn't a few months ago. It was days before they died. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. David hadn't just been resentful. He had been desperate. He had likely called Robert to beg for money, probably for the last time. Robert, a man who was generous but also prudent, must have refused to fund his brother's gambling habit. David's grief wasn't the fuel for this lawsuit. It was rage, the rage of a man who felt entitled to his successful brother's money and had been denied. The accident, in his twisted view, wasn't just a tragedy. It was a cruel irony. The source of his potential salvation was gone, and one, the survivor, was the only obstacle left between him and the money he so desperately needed. This new knowledge solidified my resolve. My fight was no longer just about defending my name and Robert's memory. It was about exposing a grotesque and predatory lie. It was about protecting my family's legacy from a man who would defile it for his own selfish gain. The final step before a potential trial was a court-ordered mediation. It was one last chance to settle. This time, I didn't dread it. I welcomed it. This wouldn't be a repeat of our last meeting. We sat in the same conference room, but the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I wasn't the fleeing, weeping woman from before. I was a survivor who had found her footing. Grace opened, her presentation calm, deliberate, and devastating. She laid out the police report. She read from the depositions of friends who spoke of our happy marriage. She presented the photographs, the letters, Robert's journals. She systematically rebuilt the fortress of our life. Then, she addressed the text message. She recounted the story I had told, the story of the Yellowstone trip, framing the message not as a complaint, but as a testament to the deep, private language of a long and happy marriage. Finally, she turned to motive. With methodical precision, she laid out the evidence of David's financial ruin, the mortgages, the credit card debt, the gambling, and finally, the record of the phone call to Robert just days before his death. She paused and looked directly at David. So, Mr. Vance, this lawsuit isn't about a perceived injustice, is it? It's about a financial hole you dug for yourself. You asked your brother for a bailout, and he said no. This lawsuit is your attempt to get the money from his widow that he refused to give you when he was alive. David's face, which had been a mask of sullen indifference, turned a pasty white. He stared at the documents on the table as if they were snakes. Mr. Davies tried to object, calling it an invasion of privacy, a character assassination, but his words had no conviction. The illusion had been shattered. The truth was laid bare on the conference room table. The mediator, a retired judge with a weary but perceptive gaze, looked at David. Son, he said, his voice a low rumble, you have a very weak case, and you're about to have a very public and embarrassing trial. I suggest you think long and hard about your next move. The fight had reached its peak. The momentum was ours, but I knew this wasn't over. Winning in a conference room wasn't enough. The poison had already spread through my town, through my life. There was one more confrontation that needed to happen. Not for the lawyers, but for me. I needed to look the man who did this to me in the eye and have the final word. The mediator gave us a break, urging David and his lawyer to have a frank discussion in private. As they retreated to a small adjoining room, the tension in our conference room deflated, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. He's going to fold, Grace said, letting out a long, slow breath. Davies is a shark, but he's not an idiot. He knows when a case is dead in the water. He'll advise David to drop it. I nodded, but I felt a strange sense of incompletion. A legal victory felt hollow, technical. The wounds David had inflicted were personal, not procedural. His accusations had lived in my head, in my heart, for months. I couldn't let it end with a quiet signature on a piece of paper, with him slinking away without ever facing what he had done. Grace, I said, my voice quiet but firm, before they come back, I need to speak with him, alone. Grace's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Eleanor, that's not a good idea. Let me handle this. There's no reason for you to put yourself through that. Yes, there is, I insisted, a calm certainty settling over me. This was never just about the law for him, and it isn't for me, either. It's about family. It's about Robert. I need to do this. She studied my face for a long moment, seeing the resolve there. She gave a small, hesitant nod. 5 minutes. I'll stand right outside the door. She went and spoke briefly with the mediator. A few moments later, David emerged from the side room alone, his face pale and drawn. His lawyer, Davies, had clearly abandoned him to face the fallout. David looked lost, diminished, a man whose bluff had been called in the most spectacular way. He flinched when he saw me standing there, waiting for him. I want to talk to you, David, I said. My voice wasn't angry. It was just clear. like a bell ringing in a quiet room. He swallowed hard and nodded, avoiding my eyes. We stood in the middle of the room, the conference table laden with the evidence of our lives between us. The silence stretched for a long moment. Why? I asked finally. It was the only question that mattered. Not the lawsuit. Not the money. Why did you say that to me? In my house. You should have died too. Why would you say that to anyone? He finally looked up, and for the first time, I saw something other than resentment in his eyes. I saw a flicker of the broken man he was. I don't know. He mumbled, his voice hoarse. I was angry. At everything. At him. At Robert? I asked, my voice softening despite myself. Why were you angry at him? Because it was always so easy for him. He burst out, a lifetime of bitterness pouring out of him. Everything he touched worked out. The business, the marriage, the family. He was the golden boy. And I was, me. I asked him for help, for a loan. He said no. He gave me a lecture about responsibility. A lecture. 2 days later, he's gone. And all that success, it was just sitting there. He gestured vaguely at the table, at the imagined fortune he thought he was owed. It wasn't fair. He whispered. He had everything. And then he was gone. And you were still there. You got to keep it all. It wasn't fair. Hearing the raw, pathetic jealousy in his voice, something inside me broke. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was a profound, aching sadness. He didn't see a grieving woman. He saw an obstacle. He hadn't mourned his brother. He had mourned the loss of a potential bank account. He didn't have everything. David, I said softly. He had us, and we had him. That's what he worked for. Not the house, not the money in the bank. He worked for the feeling of sitting around the dinner table on a Sunday night, listening to his granddaughter talk about her week at school. He worked for the quiet moments, holding my hand on the porch swing. That's what you tried to take. Not the money. You tried to take the memory of that. You tried to make it ugly. I took a step closer. You talk about what's fair. Let me tell you about what's not fair. It's not fair that my 7-year-old granddaughter never got to have another birthday. It's not fair that my son will never teach another history class. It's not fair that his wife will never make another beautiful piece of pottery. And it is not fair that the man I loved for 45 years died on a wet highway next to me. Tears were streaming down my face now. But my voice didn't waver. You lost a brother. I understand that loss. But I lost my entire world. And in my darkest moment, when I was drowning in grief, you didn't throw me a rope. You threw me an anchor. You tried to pull me under with you. He flinched as if I'd struck him. Finally, truly seeing the depth of the cruelty he had inflicted, he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was nothing to say. My truth was absolute, undeniable. I'm not going to forgive you, David, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. Not because I hate you, but because forgiveness is something you earn, and you have done nothing to earn it. But I am going to let you go. You and your bitterness and your greed. You will have no more power in my life. You will not be the author of my story. My family's story ends with love. Not with this. I turned and walked to the door where Grace was waiting. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I had said everything that needed to be said. I had faced the monster, and I had discovered he was just a small, sad man. As Grace had predicted, David dropped the lawsuit an hour later. The official document was a dry, anticlimactic and 2 months of emotional warfare. There was no public apology, no admission of guilt, just a legal surrender. Driving home from Portland, I watched the familiar landscape of Oregon roll by tall pines, the gray rivers, the green hills. It was the same scenery from the day of the accident, but it looked different. I was different. When I got home, the silence in the house was still there. It always would be. The ache of their absence was a phantom limb, a pain that would likely never fade completely. But it was no longer a suffocating, accusing silence. It was just quiet. It was a space that was now mine to fill. I walked through the house, room by room, I looked at Sarah's pottery, Michael's books, Robert's armchair. The objects were no longer accusations. They were just memories. Beautiful, precious memories that were mine again, untainted by doubt or blame. I went to Lily's room and picked up her memory box. I took out her diary and held it to my chest. She hadn't just given me back myself. She had shown me the way forward. Grandma is the best storyteller in the world. For months, I had been trapped in the story of my grief, a story of loss, guilt, and survival. But that wasn't the only story. There were other stories to tell. Stories of love, of laughter, of family, and perhaps new stories yet to be written. The legal battle was over, but I knew my own healing was a different kind of journey, one that was just beginning. The lawsuit had forced me to build a fortress to protect my past. Now, I had to figure out how to build a bridge to a future I never asked for, a future I had to live for all of them. The question was, how? The weeks after the lawsuit ended were strange. The town of Cedar Creek seemed to collectively hold its breath, unsure how to act around me. The news that David had dropped the case spread quickly. There were no victory parades, no public vindications, just a slow, awkward recalibration of gossip and opinion. Some people, like Martha Gable, would now offer a hesitant, guilt-ridden smile when we crossed paths at the market. I would simply nod back. I had no energy for their apologies or their pity. My battle was over. I had no interest in presiding over their surrender. The real change wasn't happening in the town. It was happening inside the walls of my quiet house. And inside me, the anger that had fueled me through the legal fight had subsided, leaving a vast, quiet space in its wake. The grief was still there, a constant companion, but its sharp edges had softened. It was no longer an active tormentor but a gentle ache, a reminder of the depth of my love. I started with a small act of reclamation. I went into the garage, picked up the half-finished birdhouse on Robert's workbench, found the right can of paint, and gave it a final, steady coat of bright blue. I hung it on the old oak tree in the backyard, in a spot where I could see it from the kitchen window. It was a small, simple thing, but it felt monumental. It was the first time I had finished something he had started. It was an act of continuation, not just preservation. Slowly, carefully, I began to bring the house back to life. I cleaned the dust from Sarah's pottery and arranged it on the mantelpiece, not as a memorial, but as a collection of beautiful art. I took Michael's history book from the nightstand and started reading it from the beginning. I wanted to see the world through his eyes for a little while, but Lily's room remained my sanctuary. Her memory box was no longer a source of pain, but a wellspring of purpose. She is the best storyteller in the world. The words echoed in my mind, not as a memory, but as an instruction. One sunny Saturday in early spring, I took a small, wooden sign I had painted and hammered it into the lawn near the sidewalk. It read, "Story time in Lily's garden, Saturdays at 10 a.m. All are welcome." I took a few of Lily's favorite picture books, a large blanket, and a pitcher of lemonade and set them up under the oak tree, next to the new blue birdhouse. I had no idea if anyone would come. The thought was terrifying. What if no one showed up? What if they were all still too awkward, too afraid to approach the tragic Mrs. Vance? I sat on the blanket, my heart pounding, and waited. At 10:05, I saw a young mother I recognized from the library walking hesitantly down the street, with her two small children. She paused at the edge of my lawn, looking at me with an uncertain expression. I gave her a small, genuine smile. "There's plenty of lemonade," I said, my voice clearer than I expected. She smiled back, a look of relief washing over her face, and guided her children onto the grass. A few minutes later, another family arrived, and then another. Soon, there were a dozen children sitting on the blanket, their faces bright with anticipation, while their parents sat in lawn chairs I'd brought out, speaking in quiet, respectful tones. I picked up the first book, the one Lily had loved most, about a brave little bear searching for his lost hat. I took a deep breath. looked at the circle of small, upturned faces, and began to read. The bear was sad. I started, my voice a little shaky at first. He had lost his favorite hat, and he didn't know where to find it. As I read, something magical happened. I wasn't just reciting words from a page. I was performing. I made my voice deep and gravelly for the grumpy badger. I made it high and squeaky for the timid mouse. The children giggled. Their eyes were wide with wonder. I could feel their collective imagination taking flight. And in that shared space, my own spirit began to lift. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the survivor. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the defendant. I was Grandma, the storyteller. And in the sound of the children's laughter, I could hear the echo of Lily's. It felt like a hug. From that day on, story time in Lily's garden became a weekly ritual. It grew. Week by week, people started bringing their own blankets, their own snacks to share. It became a quiet, gentle hub for the community, a place of healing I hadn't intended to create but desperately needed. It was my bridge to the future. I never sold the house. It was too full of the ghosts I had come to love. They were no longer haunting specters but quiet companions. I still talked to them, but my conversations were different. I no longer apologized for being alive. Instead, I told them about my day. Robert, I'd whisper to his empty chair in the evening. You should have seen little Sam's face today when the dragon appeared. It was priceless. Lily, my darling, I'd say, standing at her door. I told the story about the bear today. They loved it just as much as you did. I never saw David again. I heard through Mr. Henderson that he had sold his house and moved away, overwhelmed by his debts and the quiet judgment of the town. I felt no triumph in his exile, only a distant, lingering sadness for the man he could have been, for the brother Robert had loved. My life did not return to what it was. A piece of my heart will forever be buried in that cemetery under the gray granite stone. The pain of loss is a current that will always run beneath the surface of my days. But I have learned that grief and joy can coexist. I have learned that a heart can be broken and still have the capacity to love. The silence in my house is still there at night, but now it is filled with the echoes of children's laughter from the day. It is filled with the stories I will tell next week. It is filled with the quiet strength of a woman who was forced to the very edge of despair and found a way to write her own ending. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 68 years old. I lost my family, and I survived. I was sued. I was shamed, and I was broken. But I am still here, and I have stories to tell.